and thank you so much for joining us tonight for the launch event for When You Greet Me, I Bow, Notes and Reflections from a Life in Zen. Just out today, the new book by Norman Fischer. My name's Evan Karp. I am the events manager for Booksmith. We're in an independent bookstore in a mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. So without further ado, it's my my pleasure and honor to introduce Norman Fischer. Norman is a Zen teacher, a poet, translator, and director of the Everyday Zen Foundation, a beloved figure in the Buddhist world. He's also well known for his efforts at interreligious dialogue. His numerous books include The World Could Be Otherwise, Imagination and the Bodhisattva Path, What is Zen? Plain Talk for a Beginner's Mind, and Training in Compassion, Zen Teachings on the Practice of Lojong. Norman, congratulations on the book. I'm always humbled to be in your presence and very happy to have you here with us tonight and to turn things over to you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Evan. Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. I'm used to doing Zoom events on that platform where I can see everybody's face. Doing it this way, I have no idea who's there, and I'm just talking to my own image on the screen, which is kind of weird, but let's see what happens. Thanks to Booksmith for inviting me, and thanks to Shambhala Press. Today is actually the official publication date of my book, When You Greet Me, I Bow. This is it. It just came out today, and they wanted to put my picture on the cover, which I had some resistance to, but at least it's only half my face. So I'm going to read and talk a little bit about that book, but before I do that, I want to tell you about the two poetry books that I did that just came out, one in March and one in April. So I'll just introduce those two books and read just a little pinch from each one, and then we'll get into When You Greet Me, I Bow. So the first poetry book is published by Tumba Press, which is a really great small poetry press in Berkeley, which is run by Lynn Hijinian, who's one of our great American poets. And Nature is actually a book that's in dialogue with Ralph Waldo Emerson's book-length essay by the same title. And my thought was, well, nature has a whole different meaning now in the time of ecological crisis than it had in Emerson's time, when for Emerson nature was eternity. You know, the round of the seasons was never going to change. The climate of summer, winters, fall, and spring was eternal. It would always be the same. And when he was contemplating nature, that was the assumption. Well, now the assumption is really different. So this book is about that difference. I'm going to read you just about a page. It's written in prose, but it's understood as a poem in the sense that I'm not doing a linear, cogent argument, but I'm improvising. So I'm reading on page 36 of the book. Therefore is nature round and full with variety and color, from insects to distant stars and every natural occurrence, from the dropping of a pin to the launching of a rocket, from the twirling, falling, deep red autumn leaf to the decimated rainforest. Every animal function, from the sponge to little Nas X, whispers or shouts to us of right and wrong, of the Ten Commandments, of the universal moral precept within which all that moves must turn. Nature is religious. Her garments, her ruffles, her feathers, her smooth and jerky movements that never cease confirm her religious sentiment and awesome confusion and childish wonderment anyone, when sufficiently shocked or sufficiently ignorant, if only momentarily, will feel. Nature is so essentially and indelibly, so shockingly moral that it seems she was made to speak out loud of what should be done at any turn and to speak so in such code that right conduct would be stunningly obvious if hidden to the senses and reason. Whatever one creature needs for its survival, however much it may claw or passively impede passage for another, this essential and transcendent caring is its true purpose, sheathed in its apparent instinctual and unconscious selfishness. Nothing in nature ever ends. No thing or force isn't used again and again. Nothing not sacrificed finally and offered over for the good of others in its continuing. When one thing dies, it appears again as sustenance for another thing. Thus there are no things, only arrangements and transfigurations without border or boundary. In nature, the movements of peoples and forces across spaces, times, and apparent markers that delimit it is ceaseless, abundant, and free. So all artificial barriers, all pinched limitation, and all commodity are squalid. Nature teaches us that a thing has the right and the purpose of its being what it is in order to serve. A thing strives to realize itself moved by its inner force so that it reaches a height from which it falls, offering its hurled body to the filled space around it. Thus we are compelled to train in the ABCs of altruism. So that's nature. And this is a photograph, which some of you in the Bay Area may remember, of a day, I forget when it was, in the fall, when the sun never came up in the Bay Area. This is a picture taken in midday. I don't know if your screen shows, but it's a very orange sky, taken at our house here in Muir Beach. This other book that came out a month later, at the end of April, published by Lavender Inc. Press in New Orleans, and thanks to Bill Lavender, who operates that press. This is a pandemic poem. I wrote it during the pandemic, and it quickly came out with unprecedented speed. It's a collage text. It has quotations, sometimes altered and bent, and sometimes verbatim, from various sources, and it really is a kind of kaleidoscope of pandemics. It's about pandemics in Roman times, pandemics in the 17th century, pandemics in medieval times, and of course pandemic in our time. And it's got all kinds of different work in it, all collaged together to make sense, I think, in some way anyway. So I'm going to just read a short section that starts on page 121. The whole text is about 145 pages. There had been storms every night, but last night's was strongest. A tremendous storm, thunder and bright lightning, many flashes close in, lighting up the sky as if day, torrential rain pounding the cocoa palms, lasting an hour or two, maybe 3 to 5 a.m., impossible to sleep through. Today, the path to the house is a stream bed, ants swarming the rocks and up and down trees to stay dry. 2 nights ago, a blood-curdling cry in the jungle crossed between a dog and a cat. A fishing boat very close in, surrounded by pelicans and frigate birds, dive-bombing the boat and fighting over fish, their shark-bite wings, forked tails and long, straight, primitive beaks, as in Olson's Mayan letters. In the pleading, another voice speaks, not yours. Hear the sounds, see the sights, the sky with its endless terraces, the scream of an ancient call that floats or bobs on the waters in the hush I don't know, nor can see. Language is such a disappointment. clunky words that mean so little. How can an author have confidence? How can a king rule? A crown not distribute its lethargy. Sorry. I'm making up a new poem as I go along. A crown not distribute its lethargy. Sorry, I said it again. A crown not distribute its lethality. A crown not distribute its lethality is how it's written here. Bracing perceptions blow you back. A terror freezes fluid, bone solid. It isn't even you anymore. White hot for the world to pull its handle, and you go down, riding those waves of sound, in a pinch anyway. And who are you pinching? I'm pinching you, pinching me. It's the only way. I know I'm alive. But if you know, and if you pinch, are you still alive? Is knowing a kind of death? An absence papered over with thought? Love must burn, just the way it did when I didn't know who you were, or what you were, or what I was. Love me then like a rake loves gravel. A tree loves a snake. An apple loves loins at break of day. The cover of this is from a painting of Kaz Tanahashi, who's another local Berkeley calligrapher and artist, and it's a beautiful picture that appears on the cover of the book. So now we come to the main celebration tonight, which is the publication of When You Greet Me, I Bow. And this book I've been writing for 30 years, because it's a collection of my published essays that appeared mostly in the Buddhist magazines and other magazines since the early 90s or late 80s. And this is not all the essays I published, but the essays were selected and organized by Cynthia Schrager, who's a brilliant editor and a great reader and appreciator of writing. And I asked Cynthia to take on the job, and she was willing to do it, and did a great job of, first of all, finding where all these essays are, because I lost track of most of them, and then selecting the ones that were worth reprinting, and then organizing them into categories. And then she and Shambhala, the publisher, had the idea of adding new writing to the text. So she was thinking of a great book called by Ta-Nehisi Coates called We Were 8 Years in Power. Maybe you know that book. It's a similar project of his where he published 8 lengthy essays that had been previously published. He collected them together in a book, and then he wrote notes introducing each essay where he could reflect on, what it was like at the time of writing the essay and what that essay looks like to him now, some years later. So I decided to do the same thing with Cynthia's urging. So there's new writing for each of the sections of the book. And I guess these themes that define the sections of the book pretty much do speak to the things that I've been, without necessarily planning on it, obsessed with over all these years. So part 1 is called Only a Buddha in a Buddha, Notes on the Joy and Catastrophe of Relationship, because spiritual practice is about relationship, I've come to feel, more than anything else, or as much as anything else. Part 2, Form is Emptiness, Notes on Thinking, Writing, and Emptiness. The emptiness teachings of Buddhism are the very profound and mystical teachings that I've been really interested in ever since the beginning of my practice. Part 3, East-West, Notes on Cultural Encounter. I was an early practitioner of Buddhism. I've been practicing Buddhism more or less full-time for almost 50 years now. But I was very conscious of the fact that I was among the first people whose teachers were all Westerners. I didn't go to Asia and study with Asian teachers, and I didn't study with the great Asian teachers who were in America. They all had passed by the time I was beginning to practice Zen. So the idea of, what is this tradition for us as Americans was always important to me from the very beginning, and also since I was a poet all along and concerned with the American poetic tradition and American culture, the issue of culture and cultural borrowing really always interested me. So that's a whole section of the book. And the last part is Difference and Dharma, Notes on Social Engagement, because I think that, there's different, as you know, many different forms and schools of Buddhism. But in Mahayana Buddhism, the main thoroughfare of practice is compassion. And if you are concerned with, your own life and what it really is, you end up being concerned about others and about compassion. If you're concerned about others, then you're engaged in the world, and you care about the world, and you want to live and act in such a way that the world is a better world. So spiritually, social engagement is an imperative, and so the fourth section is about that. So I'm going to read a few sections. I'm going to read a little bit from the title essay, "When You Greet Me, I Bow," which I believe is the first it's the first essay in the book. And it was published in 2011. Most people come to Zen practice not quite knowing what to expect. Popular images of tough Zen masters, rigorous retreats, and hard-won enlightenment experiences may obscure the fact that when you come down to it, Zen is as much about relationship and interaction as anything else. Think of the koan literature for which Zen is famous. On the surface, these stories flash with enigma and a wonderful patina of the exotic, to Westerners anyway. But scratch the surface and you realize that the stories are basically about encounters between people. Zen koan literature is essentially dialogic. The typical Zen story involves two or more people who seem to be on intimate terms with one another, bringing up the teaching in dynamic, even amusing ways. Because the protagonists know each other so well and share a serious and long-standing commitment to the Dharma, they don't need to stand on ceremony. Their discussions, which are sometimes wordless, are always laconic, rough, and full of affectionate slang and jokiness, and relationship itself, with all its glitches and contradictions, is often the subject matter. So contrary to expectations, Zen stories may have something fresh to say about the tricky and problematic nature of relationship. Here's one. Longtan made rice cakes for a living, but when he met the priest Tianhuang, he left home to follow him. Tianhuang said, "Be my attendant. From now on, I will teach you the essential Dharma gate." After a year, Longtan said, "When I arrived, you said you would teach me, but so far, nothing has happened." Tianhuang said, "I've been teaching you all along." Longtan said, "What have you been teaching me?" And Tianhuang said, "When you greet me, I bow. When I sit, you stand beside me. When you bring tea, I receive it from you." And here's another of my favorite Zen stories. One day, while Guishan was lying down, Yangshan came to see him. Guishan said, "Let me tell you about my dream. And Yangshan leaned forward to listen. And Guishan simply said, "Would you interpret my dream for me? I want to see how you do it." In response, Yangshan brought a basin of water and a towel. Guishan washed his face and sat up. Then Xiangyan came in. And Guishan said, "Yangshan and I have been sharing miracles. This is no small matter." And Xiangyan said, "I was next door and I heard you." And Guishan said, "Why don't you try?" So Xiangyan made a bowl of tea and brought it to him. Guishan praised them both, saying, "You two students surpass even Shariputra and Moggallana, who were intimate disciples of the Buddha, with your miraculous activity." So, to me, these are really great stories about people who know each other so well and whose minds and hearts are so much in harmony that they have no need to explain or discuss. They are so close, they can communicate everything with a bowl of water or a bow. Simply appreciating being together, sharing life basically and intimately, they understand one another at a level far beyond ordinary needs and wants and arguments. Of course, not all Zen stories illustrate this perfect accord between practitioners, but those that do are eloquent in just this way. They are saying that simply being together with warm-hearted kindness, dropping storylines, and appreciating each other's profound human presence is actually the whole of the teaching. These stories don't mention meditation insights, esoteric teachings, or fancy Buddhist doctrine. Intimate and caring relationship is the miracle that is so moving to Guishan. Now I'm skipping a section skipping ahead to another section of the essay. Recently, so in 2010 or 11 recently, I attended a funeral at the San Francisco Zen Center for the priest Shuun Mitsuzen, Lou Hartman, who had died at the age of 95. He had been married for 63 years to Zenkai Blanche Hartman, who was co-abbot of the center with me more than 20 years ago. Since then, Blanche has also passed, but at the time of this writing, she was still alive. To open the ceremony, as is the Zen custom, Blanche carried Lou's ashes into the Buddha Hall and placed them on the altar. Though there are probably very few people who appreciate the Buddhist teaching of impermanence as much as Blanche does, she cried quite a bit as she placed the ashes down. And so did I. Lou had been quite famous around the Zen Center as a talker, a curmudgeon, and a great doubter. He was absolutely faithful to daily meditation and ritual practice, and he took care of altars and small repairs constantly. But he was outspoken in his scorn for any sort of falseness or cant, was almost incapable of taking anything on faith alone, and didn't have a pious bone in his body. His manner was gruff and probably a little scary to new students, and in some ways, despite his long marriage, fatherhood, and many years living communally in the temple, he was really a loner. So the expressions of love and tender regard for him that were made at the funeral were eloquent testimony that what counts in human interaction isn't outward sweetness, polite solicitude, or fulfilling others' needs and expectations. It's the capacity to show up intimately and honestly with one's whole self, for and with each other over time. It's not necessary that the people we love be perfect or even overcome what might be serious personal defects. Living together for a long time with practice as a backdrop, we can get over our need for others to be as we wish they were and appreciate them as they are. The celibate monks of old China and the married priests of San Francisco Zen Center may be living in unusual situations, but the basic template of what they have learned from the Zen tradition about relationships is useful for the rest of us too. Though we may not be able to replicate their lives, we can, I am quite sure, find a way to capture the essence of the practice that they've done, and it can help us with our contemporary relationship problems. There is, of course, some serious effort involved, meditating on one's own and at group retreats, listening to teachings, and the daily effort of paying attention. But these are things that can realistically and successfully be done if you feel it's a priority. The most important thing is coming back to presence every day, back to the breath, back to sitting, walking, standing, and remembering that this is what we are more than anything else. And we can do this practice with as much integrity as Guishan, Longtan, or Lou Hartman. We can remind ourselves that when our passions are aroused or when we feel our needs are unmet, we can just return to presence and feel whatever we feel with some forbearance. We don't need to make it go away, and we don't need to insist that others do what we think we need them to do. What we think we need them to do. Let's see. So now I'll read you from, I'll finish with this piece, and then hopefully we'll have some dialogue. If not, I can read a little bit more. This is from the notes, contemporary notes, on this question of cultural encounter. It's a very interesting thing, and actually one of the most important developments in culture, really, of the last century or so, this transmission of between East and West, Western ways pervading the Asia now, and Asian religion and other ways coming into the West. This is a really big deal. It's changing both cultures. It's changing world culture. So how does that work? And what are the ins and outs of it? So this is from my contemporary notes on this section of the book called Cultural Encounter. When I was doing a reading at a bookstore in Vancouver, British Columbia, not long ago, it was a reading for my book, The World Could Be Otherwise. That's just a couple years old, year and a half old or something like that. So when I was doing a reading in Vancouver, a young Chinese woman in the audience said that when she was growing up in China, she naturally thought of Buddhism as a very silly thing that was only relevant to superstitious grandmothers. As far as she knew, Buddhist temples were dusty, dark places where people burned paper money, not real money, but play money, to provide economic sustenance for their relatives in heaven. When she immigrated to Canada and noticed to her surprise that educated and aware white people were practicing Buddhism, she decided to investigate. And she discovered something completely different from what she had seen at home. a practical psychological practice that would help you in your life. So later, after that incident, I repeated this story at a public Dharma talk, and I was castigated by a white American woman in the audience who told me that I sounded like a cultural imperialist, that I was implying that old Chinese people were stupid and backward, and that only we educated modern white Western people, because as you know, the Buddhist movement is largely white, although thank goodness that's changing now rapidly, but that only we educated modern Western people really knew what Buddhism was or was supposed to be. And even though, that obviously wasn't my intention, she did have a point. Because in the beginning of the Buddhist movement, let's say it really took off in the 60s, in the beginning there was an almost cultish respect for Asian teachers and whatever they said. But it only took about 10 or 15 years for an unconsciously arrogant, Western cultural superiority to be asserted. The sense that Western Buddhists were casting aside the cultural baggage of the old Asian Buddhism and finding the true essence of Buddhism for the West. And this idea actually came from the first Buddhist scholars, the first Western Buddhist scholars, who were British and German, and they're the ones who first translated Buddhism into Western languages in the 19th century. And they did that because they were colonizing Asia. And they had this assumption also. They assumed that the pure and true Buddhism that they were finding in the original texts had been corrupted by years of tradition and was only now being refurbished by them, the superior Western scholars who found the true wisdom of the East that the East had forgotten about. That's what they thought. And according to this way of looking at it, Buddhism, or any religion or philosophy or praxis, is an eternal essence to be extracted from ancient sacred texts, which essence is bound to be corrupted over the centuries by ignorant practitioners. And that was the view, and still today some people think, well, we're getting the essence, and why do we need all this extra ritual and this other nonsense when we can get the real stuff extracted from it, like as if you could juice an apple or something and get the apple juice out of it, and then you don't need the pulp. But contemporary scholars of religion have a very different point of view. They are uncovering the biases of the early scholars who were studying a Buddhism that they did not realize they themselves were constructing and making up. Today's scholars say that religion is not what the texts seem to say it is. Of course, texts can be read in many ways, especially when you're reading them across cultural boundaries and across languages. So religion, is not what the texts seem to you to be saying. Religion is what people who practice this religion feel and think and do and believe as they interpret or sometimes ignore their own texts. So the idea that religions become corrupted over time isn't really sensible. Religions change over time for sure. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But of course they change according to the uses that people need to make of them. So it's interesting to think of the Buddhist practice that we're doing now in the West, in the Bay Area, where we're theoretically reading from, is a cultural center for Buddhism, probably in the Western world. It's interesting to think of what we're doing in the context of the whole history of the transmission of Buddhism from Asia to the West, and how that's all taken place. So, on the theory that there is someone listening, as far as I know, there's nobody listening, and I've been just talking to myself, or maybe Evan. Oh, maybe Evan was actually out watching something on Netflix, and then he just came back. I don't know.
I bet. What I miss?
Anyway, on the theory that there is someone there, let's see if there's anything coming from the audience to talk about.
Thank you, Norman. This has been wonderful, and we do have some audience questions. If you're holding on to a question, it's not too late to ask. Just drop it in the chat. The first I would like to ask of you, Norman, is from Mark Siegel, who is wondering why practice Zen if there is nothing to attain? Isn't it like trying to get somewhere else other than this?
That's a great question. And it's sort of a tricky thing to talk about because, right, there is nothing to get. There is nothing to Zen practice, I think, other than what I was saying in one of the things I read, the real presence of our own lives, of our own bodies, our own breath, of our own experiences, of our own interactions. So we're not adding anything or getting anything that we don't already have. But the trouble is, and probably it's Mark, right? Is it Evan, Mark? Probably.
That's right. That's right.
Probably, Mark, you would have to agree with this yourself. I don't know, maybe you wouldn't, but most people would agree, I think, that they don't feel, their sacredness. They don't feel the beautiful, sort of eternal intensity of being alive as a human being, which is an incredible experience. It's almost an unbearably gorgeous experience living a human life, which is so brief. We don't mostly experience it like that. We are living it, because we're here. We are. This is us, but we don't really feel our living. The other day, one of the people in our community was giving a Dharma talk. And he said something like really simple, but it really struck me. He said something like, it's all in the way you think about it. It's such a simple thing to say, but it's true, How do we conceive of and think about our lives? And mostly, we don't conceive of them or think about them in an inspired way. So I think that there's nothing to attain that we don't already have. We're not going to get something that isn't already there. But maybe we're going to be able increasingly to appreciate and rest ourselves more fully in what is already there. So there's no attainment. But to really feel this life as it is very beautiful. And maybe it takes the effort of spiritual practice to get us home to where we already are. So thanks for the question, Mark. It is the question, isn't it?
And so Mark is following up, if I may, asking, but isn't that just me making something?
No, it's you unmaking something. It's you shedding all the ideas that may or may not be you may or may not be aware of that you're holding in your heart that are separating you from your actual life. Letting go of those, shedding those, and just being here is not you making something up, it's you living.
That's a good point. Thank you. And Mark, thank you for those questions. So the next question I want to ask is from Dr. Paula Bromberg. Paula says, I love and have read all of your books. I also love Alan Liu. Can you speak to your connection to Reb Allen?
Oh, thanks, Dr. Paula. Yes, one of the essays in the book that is most dear to me is about my friendship with Rabbi Lou. It's about spiritual friendship in general, and what a beautiful thing that is, as illustrated in the stories that I read a moment ago. But in the essay, I talk about Rabbi Lou. He and I met on the first day of class at the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop. I was not practicing Zen. He was not a rabbi. Had no concept that he would ever become a rabbi. We were both writers at the famous Writers' Workshop, there to get our MFA in writing and to have time to write and get better at it. And we became really close friends. And after we finished Iowa in 1970, we both moved to California, and we really didn't, neither one of us knew anybody in California, so we were, close with one another in those times that were so strange. The early 70s were still the spirit of the 60s, and California was a very fruitful place, a strange and wonderful place for everybody concerned. So we had a great time of it, and we then began practicing Zen together. And after about 10 years of Zen practice, Allen met the writer Cheryl Jaffe, who Evan knows well, because Evan used to be, after Allen's death, Evan was Cheryl's housemate, and that's how come I know Evan. Anyway, they got married, and they said, well, how are we gonna get married? Who's gonna perform the ceremony? And they said, well, we're both Jewish, so let's see if there's a local rabbi who will do it for us. And there was a local rabbi who they just didn't know, but because neither one of them was a practicing Jew, they were secular Jews. But the rabbi came and performed the wedding ceremony, and one thing led to another, and the rabbi influenced Allen to start attending services at the synagogue up there, I think in Sebastopol. And Allen, because of his 10 years of Zen practice, really took to it intensely. He was a very passionate person. Whatever he did a lot of different things. Whatever he did with abandon. So he was doing Judaism all of a sudden. And then, after a fairly short period of time, the rabbi, who was European, had to go back to Europe. He had visa problems or something, and he had to leave the congregation. And the congregation said, well, Allen, why don't you become our lay rabbi? So he became the lay rabbi of the congregation. And after a while, they said, you're really good at this, and you should become an actual rabbi. So they wrote letters to the Jewish Theological Seminary, urging the seminary to accept Allen as a rabbinical student, even though he was about 10 or 15 years older than most rabbinical students at that time, and he had no background whatsoever in Judaism, other than being born into a Jewish family, but non-observant. So he went to the Jewish Theological Seminary, where, astonishingly, as if it were some kind of a miracle, he became the leading student at the Theological Seminary. He studied night and day. He was incredible. I went to some of the classes with him when I visited him in New York, and it was like a dialogue between Allen and the teacher of Talmud, because everybody else in the class was completely lost. Studying Talmud is very difficult, but somehow or other, it was astonishing. Allen immediately took to it and understood it. And anyway, long story short, he became a rabbi, moved back to San Francisco, and then we had a lot to do with each other again, and we started a Jewish meditation center together, which still exists 12 years now after his passing. It's called Makor Or, and we still have programs, and I still teach Jewish meditation at Makor Or, and we were very, very close. We were, how can I even explain? We were, our destinies in some way were intertwined, and who he was and who I was and am would not have been anything like what it is. if it were not for our connection to one another. So I can't even explain. It goes beyond, it's friendship, it goes beyond, because a lot of times we didn't talk, we just understood. Just like in the stories I read, we just understood one another. We worked together all the time. We never had conversations about what are we doing. We just knew what to do together all the time. It was wonderful to practice together with him. We had he came back to the Bay Area in the early 90s, and he lived until 2009. And in all that time, we practiced together quite a bit and did wonderful things together. And I really miss him a lot. And that essay, as well as several others, refer to him in the book. So thank you for bringing him up. Just thinking about him, I feel happy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paula, for that question. And Norman, I thank you. I really enjoyed, I didn't know some of that also, so it was very nice for me to hear and learn that. The next question comes from Betsy, who I think is referring to some of the discussion earlier when she asks, can you say what keeps us from recognizing our lives as the sacred experience?
Thanks for that question, Betsy. And also, just to finish, one more thing about Dr. Paula. I want to thank her for reading my books. I really appreciate that. I don't take it for granted. Thank you so much. Betsy, what keeps us from realizing the sacred beauty of our lives? Well, in the classic Buddhist discussion of this, they say what keeps us from it is ignorance, not knowing who and what we really are. And then you might ask, well, then what's the cause of that? How did that come about? And the classical answer is, it didn't come about, it just always was that way. So in a way, we look around us and we can easily observe that human beings are really, really wonderful, beautiful creatures, and also really terrible creatures. I think you could easily argue that human beings, among all the species of plants and animals on Earth, are the most pernicious, you could say. So we appear to have this double nature, right? We have ingrained in us tremendous, selfishness and ideologies of hate and nastiness. And also, apart from hate and nastiness, just a tremendous tendency to separate ourselves, right? And favor ourselves. I'm for me and get out of my face, right? I want to make sure that everything is okay with me and you might be in my way. And when I just see you, I'm wary of you already because I know what I want and you might not give it to me. So that seems to be ingrained in us. We have this in us. And so it seems like human beings have this necessity to overcome part of our nature in order to realize another part of our nature, which is, our inherent goodness and our inherent sacredness. So, where it comes from, why it is that way, the Buddhists didn't really try to answer that question. They just said it's just that way. It doesn't matter why or where it comes from. The only thing that matters is to make the effort to overcome it in ourselves. So that's the path, right? That's the journey. We have to go forth and oddly make a big effort just to be who we were all along, but because of this other side of our nature couldn't see it. So I don't know if that's a very satisfactory answer, but that's how I understand it, Betsy. There's no escape from being who we are, And so I think that because of who we are, we need spirituality of some sort to overcome. It can be quite miserable being human, right? Very miserable. We have to make sure that doesn't happen to us.
Thank you, Norman, and thank you, Betsy, for your question. Of course, feel free to follow up in the chat if you have a follow up. The next question I'd like to ask is from Lainey Brown. Lainey is wondering, Norman, can you please share some of the insights that arose when revisiting the essays that you wrote decades ago? What was that like for you?
Hi, Lainey. I wish I could see you. Lainey's a good friend of mine she's a wonderful poet and also astute spiritual practitioner. So I'm really glad that you were aware of this reading and that you're here. Thanks. And like I say, I wish I could see you now that I'm talking to you. Anyway, and Lainey, has written many books. So maybe, Lainey, I don't know what your experience is when you look over texts that you've written. But it's a complicated thing, right? I mean, I don't necessarily like what I have written before. I mean, I like it when I'm writing it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be writing it or certainly publishing it. So I have a total belief in it at the time I'm writing it. And I also, oddly, when I'm doing a reading, that belief and faith in the text returns. So there are no other texts but the one I'm writing or reading at that time. But if I'm opening up the book and looking at what I've written, I don't necessarily like it or think that much about it. I like what other people write better, usually. But it was interesting to read these essays because some of them were written a long time ago. There's one essay in the book that was an amazing experience to read this essay. Again, I wrote it in the early 90s. It's called Racism, Buddhism, and Jazz. And what I said in this essay in something like 1992, I said that if Buddhism is about suffering and the end of suffering, which is sort of the main thoroughfare of Buddhist practice, and if you're an American practicing Buddhism, then you can't practice Buddhism without understanding African American suffering, because it's so central to what it is to be an American, whether you're a white or a non-white American. The suffering of African American people is central to our American story. It's formed all of us. So you have to understand that suffering in that culture. And so I was advocating, you should study jazz. You should, this was like probably before I even understood anything about hip-hop and other forms of music that came later. Jazz is now like classical music in the African American community. But anyway, you have to understand jazz, and I actually undertook a major study of jazz and other aspects of African American culture. So this sounds good, right, when I say it now? However, when I read the essay, I and all of us have understood so much more in the last 30 years about African American experience in the United States that we didn't know, white people didn't know, that my essay was riddled with attitudes, phrases, and sentences that were, by today's standards, like completely white supremacist. Even though I was writing this essay, which was in intention anything but white supremacist, right? The essay was full of white supremacy. So, like, my editors, we went back and forth, like trying to fix it and write that stuff out of it, and could I preserve the essay, or would it kill the essay if I rewrote it to that extent? And many times I thought, let's just forget about it. We can't publish it because it's just... But then with their help, we rewrote it enough so that hopefully we wrote all that stuff out of it. But that just gives you an example of, writing gets dated, right? I mean, it's less true of imaginative writing than it is of essay writing about topics, right? But there are a lot of things in here that are like that are very dated, that I would not say in the same way. But, the book includes as I said in the beginning, sections that precede each division in the book, so that I can actually, where there was an essay that I no longer agreed with or thought was wrong, I could say so. I could say, you know, I wrote this then and it made sense at the time, but I really don't feel that way now. And I did, in many cases, rewrite where I thought that I was so wrong I couldn't republish. I actually rewrote a number of the essays to reflect my current thinking. So it was an interesting experience. Writing is a funny thing, you know. It appears in print, and then there it is, like forever and ever, you know, or until somebody forgets about it. And even if you don't agree with it anymore, you're sort of stuck with it. And also, you're very exposed, right? Your past stupidity is there. It is. Everybody can see it, and there's no hiding anywhere. So anyway, it was that kind of experience, Lainey, and I don't know if it would be the same. Like, because I can reread my poetry texts, you know, from 30 or 40 years ago too, and I don't have the same kind of embarrassment or feeling of wrong-headedness. You know, I can say maybe I'm writing better now, or I have more life experience, so there's a depth to the writing. I hope so, anyway. But anyway, it's not the same in poetry or imaginative literature, I think. But it's similar dynamic, but not quite the same.
Thank you, Norman, and thank you, Lainey. That's a question I was wondering myself. I think we have time for one more, if that's all right with you, Norman. Yeah, it's a it's a question that is coming from Nancy Romano, who is wondering, what do you mean by sacred?
Well, hi, Nancy. So it's nice to know that Nancy's here too. Nancy's also a good friend from Southern California. What do I mean by sacred? That's a good question. The word actually means something like set apart, set aside from the ordinary. What's sacred is distinguished from the ordinary. It's special in some way. But of course, I'm using it, and I think in Zen practice we use it. I mean, it's not a Zen word, right? It's a word that I use from the tradition of the English language, which includes, you know, Christianity, Judaism mostly. But the ordinary is sacred from a Zen perspective. Everything is sacred. So then, what does sacred mean if everything is sacred? And maybe then it means precious and rare. You know, we prize something that's precious and rare. You know, this is I don't know, what's an example of something precious and rare? This is, you know, the crown that Queen Elizabeth wore. It's ancient, and it's precious, and it's rare. There's no two like it. So every moment of our lives is actually just like that. Because a moment arises, and as soon as it arises, it passes away. And no amount of money or power can ever bring it back. So every moment is precious and rare because it only lasts. I mean, it doesn't last even long enough to name it. So life is like that, right? And it's so brief. You know, when you get older, you kind of like realize, wow, that went by fast. That last 30 years flew by, you know, and how many years are left, and how long will they last? 2 minutes, one more minute to live, you know. It feels like that to me. Life is precious. To live in time, an embodied person, is precious. A thought is precious. A perception is precious. So everything is very precious, and in that sense, rare, and sacred. To know that about our lives, to feel that is actually the reason why. One reason why we don't want to feel it is because, as beautiful as it is, it's also just as sad, right? Because we lost it that moment, and we'll never get it back. So it takes a lot of courage to really live the beauty and the tragedy of being human for a minute on Earth, right? Which is our condition. And how could it be anything other than sacred, precious, rare? But those are just words. None of those words describe it. So I'm meandering along like a river, trying to answer your question, Nancy. But I really appreciate your question, and I appreciate you, and I hope that I will get to see you and John again before we're all gone. I hope so.
Thank you, Norman. That was beautiful. And Nancy, thank you for your question, and thank you all so much for your questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them all, but I want to thank you for being here with us tonight, and to encourage you to get the book if you haven't done so yet. It makes great presents for friends and enemies alike, and get it from Booksmith. But if not, get it somewhere, please. And yeah, thank you for joining us. Norman, is really a pleasure to be with you tonight. Thank you for taking the time.
It's really nice to see you again. Thanks for hosting. I really, really appreciate it. And thanks to Booksmith.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Goodbye. Bye.
Good night, everyone. Take care.